getting to know you, and thanks, Alan. And we can go ahead with Jenny.
Hello, I'm on the data science team. In terms of programming, I'm more comfortable with R and SQL. For Python, I probably still consider myself as beginner. I took some deep learning course using Python, but typically we don't start from scratch. So we would have a template and we just need to make an adjustment to it.
Right. That's pretty awesome that you're into deep learning already. That's a very specific category of application when it comes down to Python. So that's cool. So yeah, thanks, Jenny. And yeah, thanks a lot to everyone for your introduction and giving me a bit of a background of your expertise on Python. And we see one thing that is consistent here is that a few of you know Python and a few of you are new to Python. So with that in mind, I'm going to be starting Python from scratch. And for those who are new to Python, if you feel like I'm going a little too fast on this or I'm going a little too slow on this as well, for that reference, you can let me know. I can adapt the pace and I can modify the pace accordingly as per your requirement when it comes down to the content. So any one of you can feel free to do that at any point. That should not be a problem. And simultaneously, for those who are already familiar with Python, since I will be starting from scratch, if there's anything specific that you'd like to ask within it, you can feel free to do that as well. So yeah, that's another thing that I want to just point out in prior. So yeah, let's not delay it further, and let me just share my screen and we can get started. Right. Yeah, before we go ahead, I hope everybody's able to see the screen and able to hear me as well.
Yep.
Right. Thanks for the response. Moving ahead from here. Now, first thing, for those who are new to Python, do you have Python installed and do you have any IDE installed as well, or would you like us to walk through it first?
So I don't have Python installed. So if we could walk through that, that'd be great.
Perfect. Which operating system do you use, Nick?
What do you mean by that operating system?
Windows.
Right? Yeah, Windows. Okay.
All right. All right. So if you're using Windows, installation of Python should be straightforward in our case. Give me just a few seconds, though. Let me just set my monitor up. Um, Apparently, I'm just having some slight issues with it. So day one, everything that can go wrong will go wrong, right? Yeah, now that it's resolved, let's get back to this. So yeah, going ahead to installation of Python within Windows. First thing, before we start with installation of Python, we can just download the latest version of Python from python.org/downloads. But before we even do that, I'm just going to walk through a few things about why we have certain version of Python still active in certain cases. So we understand what is the purpose of it, and that will lead us to one of the first things we'll learn, that is isolate each application that we develop with a separate environment of its own. So yeah, moving ahead, whenever you want to download Python or whenever you want to go ahead and install Python, you get to see here, this is the link. So for Nick specifically, you can just go to this link and here you should be able to download it, but please do not install it right away because I have a couple of specific steps that I want you to follow. So you can just click on this download Python 3.12.0 and it's just going to download an executable file that we can install from directly. But yeah, before we go ahead with that, there's one thing that I want to point out here. If you take a look at Python releases based on their date, we get to see it's incremental in terms of the version, like 3.8, then 3.9, then 3.10, 11, 12, and so on. However, one thing that you might notice when you keep scrolling down enough is that, let me just scroll down far enough to find it. Yeah, here we go. By 2020, even though Python 3.7 and 3.8 were the latest versions that were available, which were supposed to be updated and provided to a lot of people, there was still support for Python 2.7. There is no longer any support for Python 2.7, but there was still support for it back in 2020, even though the latest versions were 3.7 and 3.8. I just want to put up little description as to why this was a scenario, why Python developers, or why the developers of Python rather, specifically ensured that there's support for Python 2.7, even though Python 3 was released like much prior to that. So just to give us a heads up, there were a lot of applications that were developed when Python was in its version 2.7. Let's assume there are a few developers, or let's say data scientists, or we can take any example, any category here. Let's say there were some major applications developed with Python 2.7. Just think of something like an Instagram app for reference. So once this entire application is developed, the backend of this application is developed using Python, let's say Python 2.7, it is quite a huge application. It might have, um, yeah. So I'm not sure if someone was trying to speak something, but if so, please feel free to do that. Please don't hesitate. All right. Feel free to speak and interact at any point of time. You don't have to worry about that. But anyway, back to this point. So let's consider this. So let's assume an application is developed with Python 2.7. Let's say there were enough amount of hours utilized to develop this. Let's say something like somewhere around 60,000 plus lines of code utilized. At this point of time, once Python improved and newer versions were developed from it, and just so all of us know, because we're talking about this to begin with, I just want to give you more heads up on this. If you have a Python version like 3.8.1 or something like that, this first digit pretty much means the major changes. So whenever Python changes the first digit of their release versions, it basically means that there's some major changes. The second version is for, or second digit or number is for minor changes. And the last one is generally for bug fixes. This is pretty much how it goes. So whenever you have some major changes in, let's say, your own software that you're developing in the future, you would change the major version, then the minor version, then the bug fixes. That's just one thing for us to note, and you might be able to see this here as well, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, you can see here that from 3.10 to 11 were just bug fix, but from 3.9 to 10 was a security change. So you can observe from here as to what they think and what they release, or what they feel is worthy of changing what kind of number. So yeah, according to Python, they specify bug fix as a minor release itself, but some software developers might choose to use the third number here as well, just for our reference. Now, there was a major change in Python when it moved from 2 to 3. There were a lot of things that were different when we compared between them. And because of this, a lot of applications that were developed with Python 2.7 code would not run in Python 3. This was one of the major things that we needed to know. Now, thinking about this, Python 3.x is where some huge series of changes were made. Things like, I'll just give you a couple of simple functions so you can get to understand how major these changes were, just so we can get to know. Think about this. If you want to print something on screen, you used to just type print followed by the variable name that you want to print. Print space, let's say if A is the variable, just print A. But in Python 3, print became a function where you used to specify what you want to print within the parentheses for this function name. And another simple change, there was a function called xRange in Python 2 that was deprecated, and it became just range in Python 3. I'm just showing a couple of minor differences that you get to see here. But there were a lot of changes to improve or and to move from Python 2 to 3. And the most important change that was made from Python 2 to 3 was purely because of security reasons. The whole underlying architecture of Python 2 was modified to port it to Python 3 so that it can be more secure. Now, what about all these applications then in that case? Think about this. A company has spent so much money and manpower to develop some code in Python 2.7, and they need to port all of it to Python 3, and then they need to redeploy everything into their servers. This is going to be a very hectic task. It's going to be a very complicated task. And there might be some of these software applications which a company might not have developed, which could be something what we call as DPGs. In other words, digital public goods, which basically transform to open source. So when we think about this, we have open source applications. A lot of developers develop and provide open source applications so that others use it. And if, let's say, there's a change in Python 2 over to Python 3, all these open source applications, which a lot of people spent their effort in, and this effort spent is apart from their everyday work hours, because this is something they did because they were interested in doing it. They liked doing it. Making so much amount of effort again to move this is not feasible, right? We cannot just expect some person to spend a lot of time out to do that. With this thought in our mind, with this idea in our mind, what we can say here is this is the reason why, though Python 2 was specifically obsolete at a point of time, there were still security updates provided for Python 2 until January 1st, 2020. I think that's the date, if I'm not wrong. Let me just cross verify this. Okay, maybe I might be wrong. Okay, so April 2020, I believe. This was the last update. I believe that was the last update for reference. Yeah, I think that was. And that was the last security update provided for it. And that's the reason why they did it. This brings us to an important point. Why I spent some amount of time talking about this when we are going to develop applications that are not going to be in Python 2.7. That's because we might face the same issue in future. We are currently dealing with Python 3.12, but what if it goes to Python 4, where a lot of architectural changes are done? And what if the code that you are developing today and you spend, let's say, 6 months on a project, and you have Python 3.12 installed in your computer, and the moment it's changed to Python 4, you won't be able to run it anymore because you switch to Python 4 and you create a new application, but then this won't work. So you have to again uninstall and switch back to Python 3.12. This works, but this won't work. A lot of such scenario might happen, right? A lot of such cases might happen. Now, to resolve that, before we even start working on programming, one of the first thing we need to know is the versions of programming language or libraries that we use. The reason why I want to point this out is even with our first line of code, even if we are developing our first line of code right now, our first line of code will be developed in a separate environment, which will have its own set of libraries, and all the other environments are completely isolated from it. So I think, if I'm not wrong, I believe it was Jenny who pointed out that she's particularly into deep learning, where you're going to need to use a lot of packages like um, Keras and TensorFlow and all these things. So there might be a particular application of Python that you're developing which uses TensorFlow 1.x, and there might be one more which uses TensorFlow 2.x. Now, we cannot keep uninstalling each one and installing the other one constantly to make both our apps work, right? So, and if you want to make both of them work simultaneously, you put them in different environments where this version of TensorFlow is unique only to this environment, and this version of TensorFlow is unique only to this environment. So yeah, before we even write the first line of code, one of the first thing I wanted to point out is this best practice. And before going ahead, I just want to take maybe a few seconds on this. Um, First day one of our session, we will not directly start with the programming language as it is, because let's face it, it can be learned in many ways. We can learn the programming language as it is in more ways than one, but it's about the experience and the best practices of being a Python developer for years that comes up with that which helps us when we are learning it. I have felt the same thing when I start to learn any programming language with the expertise of experts around in the same domain, right? So with this idea, day one of our session, maybe the first 45 minutes to an hour, we might not even start with a line of code, but I hope you understand why these best practices will turn out to be basic requirements in the future when we start coding. But yeah, with that brief ahead, let's move on. Now, back to the point of installing Python. So for Nick, once you have downloaded this file, this executable file from python.org/downloads, which is the latest version that is Python 3.12, I believe it was released last week, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, 2nd of October. So yeah, all you need to do is just open this executable file to go ahead and install it. Now, there's one thing that it will particularly ask. I already have Python installed, so I'm just going to uninstall Python at my end to show you this specific step that I want you to observe when installing Python. So it might just take a few seconds. Right, there we go. So yeah, once you just select this, there's one thing that you need to know here, Nick, is that there's this option that is add python.exe to path, which is not ticked by default, and you have to tick it. The reason why you need to, yeah, so sorry. The reason why you need to do that is because when you install Python, we need to run Python from any directory that we are in within your entire PC. You might be in some directory where you have some code, and it's not necessarily going to be in the same directory where Python is installed. So you should be able to call this Python executable application from anywhere. So just select this and then go ahead to install. So that's just one thing that I would suggest to begin with. And another thing that I would always suggest for any developers to install and work around Python is to use it in a directory that does not have a space. Right now, you can see a space within my first name, last name here, but I would highly prefer anyone who is gonna install Python for long-term usage, never to install it in a directory which has a space in it. This might not inhibit your day-to-day applications with Python, but over some rare cases, it might affect a lot. So it's quite important for us to not do that. For our basic purpose, it's fine wherever we do it for that reference. So yeah, with this, you can just go ahead, click install now, and the whole thing should be installed. That should be fairly simple as that. And with that done, you should have Python installed in your PC, and we should be able to access it. Now, before we go ahead, one other query that I wanted to ask. Can you all just let me know with just one text at your end? Oh, also, hey, Brianna, and welcome to the session. Sorry, we couldn't get to know you earlier prior to the session began and so on. So yeah, just one thing that I would like to ask everyone is to just let me know which operating system you're using. Is it Windows, Mac, or Linux? Just over the chat window. This would help me out in case I need to specify some commands that I would like you to execute in different operating systems over time as well. All right. Right, that's pretty awesome. Most of us are running on Windows. Jen is working on Python over the VM. I believe. Okay, yeah, that's pretty awesome. That should be fine. But yeah, moving ahead from here. Yeah, and I guess in a way it also helps a lot of you because you have certain applications that are not available as desktop applications within Linux. Like I believe some of you are using Power BI and so on. They're not available directly as desktop applications. You can still access the cloud servers, but yeah, that helps, and I can fairly understand why a lot of you might be using Windows along with that as well. So yeah, moving ahead from that. This is basically the installation of Python. Now that we know how to install it, the next step is just to start working with it. Prior to that, yeah, Brianna, would you please let us know what is your experience and expertise in programming and Python, particularly by unmuting for a minute, if possible? I think that'll help us work around it in a better way over the next 5 days.
I'm taking a certification class in Python right now. So yeah, I would say that's my experience.
Right, that's pretty awesome. And I hope I've pronounced your name properly. If there are any issues with that, feel free to let me know. And yeah, moving ahead from that. Yeah, since you're already accustomed to Python to an extent, if you feel at any point of time during the session what I'm going through is something that you're well aware of, all of you, that you'd like me to move a little faster. But I understand that some of us might know Python better than others, which is why day one might be more of a refresher than anything else from basics when we think of it. But yeah, over time, whatever question you might have on Python throughout the series, feel free to ask. Please don't hesitate. Yeah, that's going to be a recurring sentence that I will speak. So, yeah, please bear with that. Yeah, with this, let's move ahead. So once you have installed Python, you can just go to your command prompt or terminal, whatever you might want to call this, and just type Python double hyphen version. This should tell you what is the current version of Python that is installed in your PC. I hope everybody's able to just do this and get the latest version of, or get the version of Python that's installed within their um, PC. And this is something we're going to keep doing a lot with the double hyphen, which is called flags, and we're going to go in depth about it later on. But yeah, if anyone's unable to run this, or for anyone who might get an error message when you run this, which specifically says that Python is an unknown command, please let me know. I will walk through the steps to resolve it, and then we'll go ahead to the next step. If it works for everyone, we can just move ahead without any confusions. I'll just wait for a few seconds. All right, so I'll assume that it works pretty well for each one of us, which means we can move ahead. All right. Now, moving on from here, the next thing that I want to point out is we are rarely going to be writing code without an IDE. So, for everyone who is already familiar with programming and uses an IDE, that's pretty awesome. But for those who are not, um, we're just going to introduce ourselves to one of the most popularly used IDEs, and we're just going to download that. Just to ask out of all of us, how many of you do not have let's say, Visual Studio VS Code installed within your PC. All right. So at Jenny, that's totally fine. If you have any other IDE, let's say it could be PyCharm or um, anything, that should be absolutely fine right now. But if there are any of the participants within this session who haven't installed, let's say, VS Code, you can let me know. We'll walk through that process. Otherwise, I'll just give a brief intro on IDE and we can just move forward.
I don't have I have Visual Studio Code on my personal computer, but I don't believe I have it on my work one. I have Visual Studio, but I don't have any Python extensions. Is that something I would have to download, or is Python built into Visual Studio?
Yeah, so within Visual Studio, we have the ability to add Python extensions. You can
Okay.
just go to extensions and search for Python. You should be able to find it right then and there. This is the one.
Okay.
So if you have this installed, that should be fine for us.
I'm not finding it in regular Visual Studio. Let me try to I'm not sure if I'll be able to install Visual Studio Code, but I'll give it a go.
For sure. I'll just share the link just in case. You can just download the latest Windows version from here and just install it. That should be fine. I'm not sure if, given you're working on your work computer, I'm not sure if there could be a scenario where you might not be able to install an application or so on within your work computer. That's something to think about as well. But if you're able to, this is quite awesome. And um, for all the developers, I know who I mean, the developers in this session right now, all the participants that are in this session, those who are already familiar with programming and data science, of course, to an extent, um, except for using, let's say, Colab for its obvious purposes, most of us prefer to use VS Code because it's one IDE that integrates everything. I'm sorry. So it's one IDE that integrates pretty much everything you want it to have. It could be, let's say, addition of Git. It could be easier autocomplete typing or many other things. There are a lot of features that VS Code implements, and from my experience as a developer, I've seen that VS Code is the one IDE that offers the most user-friendly programming experience than any other IDE that I have seen so far. But that is, of course, subjective as well. But yeah, from my perspective, so I would be utilizing it. Um, all the participants can feel free to utilize their own IDE as well. On the other hand, now moving ahead from here. Just another query I wanted to ask, because this is one thing that I would probably do from the second half of this session or probably from tomorrow's session. How many of you are comfortable with Git and GitHub